They said Egypt was rising, modernizing, building canals, railways, and dreams as grand as the Nile itself. But beneath the surface, that dream was bleeding debt. France and Britain stepped in, not with aid, but with chains. An international debt commission was formed, placing Egypt's economy under foreign rule. The noose tightened, and while Cairo's palaces still gleamed under European influence, Sudan far to the south rotted in neglect. Its people, hungry and unheard, were left to simmer in silence. Economic hardship choked the land. Political abandonment became the norm. Rebellion didn't just spark it, fermented. Egypt was blind to the tremors rumbling across its southern border, too busy pleasing its Western masters to notice a storm was brewing. A storm born not of soldiers, but of suffering. And soon, that storm would have a name. His name was Muhammad Ahmad. But to his followers, he would become something more, the Mahdi, a messiah, a redeemer. In the scorching heart of Sudan, this quiet cleric began preaching not just religion, but revolution. His words were fire, a return to true Islam, a purge of foreign corruption, a promise of justice in a land long betrayed. The poor flocked to him. Tribes that had feuded for generations found unity in his vision. To them, he was not merely a man, he was destiny made flesh. In 1881, with the world watching elsewhere, Muhammad Ahmad proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the guided one. Cairo took notice and laughed. They sent envoys, then soldiers, but they didn't understand what they were facing. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a resurrection, and the Mahdi wasn't waiting for permission to reshape the world. The Mahdi's defiance was not met with understanding, it was met with arrogance. Egyptian authorities dismissed him as a mere nuisance, sending a minor force of 200 men to arrest him on Abba Island. They expected compliance. What they received was carnage. The Mahdi's followers, armed with little more than faith and farming tools, sticks, stones, palm knives, descended on the soldiers with a fury born of conviction. It was a slaughter. Few Egyptians escaped, but this was no random uprising. It was the first thunderclap of a holy war. In the aftermath, the Mahdi vanished into the wilderness of Kordofan. But he wasn't hiding, he was gathering. And like embers scattered into dry grass, his message caught fire across Sudan. Rebellion had begun not in Cairo's halls of power, but in the blood-stained soil of a forgotten island. By the time the Mahdi reached the Nuba Mountains, his movement was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. Tribal banners flew alongside his green standard, and the desert echoed with cries of jihad. In late 1881, a second Egyptian force of 400 men was sent to crush him. They never stood a chance. Under cover of night, the Mahdists unleashed an ambush so devastating that not a single Egyptian officer survived. These weren't just battles, they were rituals of reckoning. The Mahdi wasn't waging conventional war. He was invoking prophecy, binding men to him with blood and scripture. His victories multiplied, and with each fallen Egyptian column, his myth grew stronger. He was no longer just resisting Egyptian rule, he was erasing it, and Cairo, still clinging to its colonial illusions, had no idea it was already losing Sudan, not just militarily, but spiritually. Mid-1882, Egypt finally reacted with urgency and folly. A larger force, 4,000 strong under Yusuf Pasha, was assembled. They marched south, confident in their numbers, oblivious to their enemy. Exhausted, starving, and ill-prepared, they set camp near the Mahdi's position and failed to post sentries. At dawn on June 7th, the desert itself seemed to scream. The Mahdists descended like a storm, swift, brutal, unrelenting. In minutes, Egyptian lines crumbled. Soldiers dropped weapons and ran, only to be cut down in the chaos. It wasn't just a defeat, it was humiliation carved in blood. When the dust settled, the Mahdi's men stood over mountains of Egyptian supplies, rifles, uniforms, ammunition, the spoils of empire now fueling a holy rebellion. The Mahdi didn't just destroy an army that day. He stole its future and repurposed it against those who sent it. In the salons of London and Paris, Sudan was still an afterthought. But behind closed doors, British advisors quietly took control of Egypt's crumbling military apparatus. Their plan: launch one decisive expedition to crush the Mahdist revolt. It would be led not by Egyptians, but by Colonel William Hicks, a grizzled veteran of the British Indian Army. His force, nearly 8,000, 300 strong with artillery, and a dozen European officers, assembled in Khartoum during the summer of 1883. But it was a force in name only, ill-prepared, poorly supplied, and lacking cohesion. It stumbled forward with a mission already doomed. By the time they set out to relieve the besieged town of El Obeid, it had already fallen. Still, Hicks pressed on deep into hostile territory, guided by unreliable maps and surrounded by sand and silence. The Mahdi was waiting, and this time, he wasn't sending warnings. He was sending annihilation. The desert swallowed them whole. Hicks' army, a column of red-coated ambition, wandered into the barren killing fields near El Obeid in late 1883. Water ran low, morale cracked, and then the Mahdi struck. 40,000 Mahdist warriors, armed with captured rifles and burning purpose, surged from every direction. The British-led force never stood a chance. Surrounded, disoriented, and betrayed by their guides, the Egyptians were hacked down in the sand, their cannons silenced, their banners trampled. Hicks was among the dead, along with nearly his entire army. Only a scattering of men limped back with tales of horror and disbelief. The massacre sent shockwaves through Cairo and London alike. The Mahdi now controlled most of Sudan. Egyptian authority, already fragile, had shattered completely. But for Britain, this wasn't just a regional disaster. It was a humiliation. And the ghost of a doomed empire now demanded a response. They sent him not to fight, but to exit quietly. General Charles Gordon, respected, unpredictable, and bound by a deep sense of duty. On the 18th of January 1884, he left England, tasked with a simple mission: evacuate the Egyptian garrisons scattered across Sudan and hand local control to a stable government. But Sudan was no longer a land of calm negotiations. When Gordon arrived in Khartoum a month later, he stepped into a crucible. The Mahdi's forces controlled the land. The garrisons were cut off. Tribal loyalties had shifted. Even the telegraph lines, his lifeline to Cairo, were severed. Trapped in a city of 7,000 soldiers, with no clear escape and no clear allies, Gordon faced a choice: obey orders or hold the line. And Charles Gordon was never the kind of man who left unfinished work behind, even if it meant dying for it. Khartoum became a fortress and a prison. As Mahdist forces tightened their grip, Gordon refused to abandon the city. He fortified the walls, rationed supplies, and sent desperate messages via runners and steamers, pleading for reinforcements. But in London, hesitation reigned. Weeks turned to months. Outside the walls, 50,000 Mahdist warriors gathered like a tide rising in silence. Inside, hunger and fear spread. Yet Gordon remained defiant, a lone figure on the palace rooftop, scanning the horizon for help that never came. Finally, under immense public pressure, Britain dispatched a relief column under Sir Garnet Wolseley. They raced up the Nile, battling terrain and time itself. On the 17th of January 1885, they fought their way to victory at Abu Klea, but it wasn't enough. When they reached Khartoum's gates, they found silence. The city had fallen 2 days earlier. Gordon was dead, and with him, British pride bled into the desert. His body was found by the palace steps, sword still at his side. Charles Gordon did not surrender. He died as he lived defiant. When the British relief force reached Khartoum in late January 1885, they found the city in ruins, 2 days too late. Streets littered with corpses, silence hanging where once commands echoed. Gordon and his garrison had been massacred. The Mahdists had claimed their most symbolic victory. In London, shock turned to outrage. Gordon, the stoic soldier saint, was now a martyr etched into imperial memory. But Britain, weary and politically divided, did not retaliate. They withdrew, leaving Sudan in Mahdist hands. What followed was not peace, but collapse. The new Mahdist state bled from within: famine, infighting, and economic ruin. Yet for now, Sudan belonged to them. a land carved in fire, ruled by faith. But far across the sea, empires do not forget humiliation. They plan. A decade passed, but Gordon's ghost never faded. His death lingered in Britain's conscience like a wound unhealed. The Mahdist state, once a symbol of divine rebellion, now crumbled under its own weight. Fractured leadership, starvation, and tribal infighting. Meanwhile, a new shadow grew in Africa: imperial competition. France crept closer to the Nile. Britain could no longer afford to ignore Sudan. In 1896, London answered not with emotion, but with precision. They turned to General Herbert Kitchener, disciplined, calculating, relentless. His mission was clear: reconquer Sudan and erase the stain of Khartoum. But this would not be another reckless march. Kitchener's campaign was modern, methodical. Backed by gunboats, artillery, and railroads, his Anglo-Egyptian army advanced like a steel tide. Where Hicks had stumbled into deserts, Kitchener brought the map, the train, and the Maxim gun. The empire was coming back not to negotiate, but to claim. The Nile became a road of conquest. Kitchener's army, 9,000 men strong with cavalry squadrons and artillery batteries, marched in disciplined columns, shadowed by gunboats that roared like thunder across the river. At every bend, they seized crossings, secured villages, and dismantled Mahdist control. In the north, the town of Dongola stood defiant until it didn't. In September 1896, British and Egyptian forces launched a coordinated assault. Mahdist defenders crumbled under superior firepower and tactical precision. The town fell swiftly, opening the gate to Sudan's heartland. Dongola was more than a military prize. It was a symbol, a declaration. The empire had returned, not with disarray, but with strategy and steel. For Kitchener, it was only the beginning. Rail lines extended behind him. Reinforcements flowed forward. Every step south was measured, fortified, and deliberate. Where Gordon had died, Kitchener would avenge not with grief, but with conquest written in cold, imperial lines. The road to Omdurman ran red with forewarning. As Kitchener's forces pushed deeper into Mahdist territory, resistance sharpened. Emir Mahmud, one of the Mahdi's fiercest successors, rallied 10,000 warriors and took position near the Nile's curve at Atbara. In the night of April 4th, 1898, Kitchener moved silently. At dawn, British and Egyptian brigades unleashed artillery, then charged. What followed was a brutal, desperate melee, hand to hand, blade against bayonet. In 45 minutes, the Mahdist camp collapsed. Mahmud was captured. Thousands were killed or captured. Atbara wasn't the final battle, but it shattered the enemy's front line. The road to Omdurman, the Mahdist capital, now lay open. The empire had learned from its failures. This was no disorganized expedition. It was a machine, grinding forward with cold precision. And ahead, in the sands of Sudan, the final reckoning waited. Omdurman would not be a battle, it would be a reckoning. At dawn on September 2nd, 1898, the desert exploded with thunder. Omdurman, the stronghold of the Mahdist dream, stood in the path of an empire now armed with steel, steam, and vengeance. Kitchener commanded 25,000 troops, including 8,000 British regulars and 17,000 Egyptian and Sudanese allies. They formed a great arc near the village of Aga, their flanks guarded by 12 gunboats moored on the Nile. Across from them, 50,000 Mahdist warriors gathered rifles and spears clutched under banners of green, ready to meet fate. Osman Azrak led the first wave, charging straight into a storm of artillery and Maxim gunfire. None reached within 20 meters. Then, Mahdist cavalry attempted a flank but ran straight into a trap. British cavalry lay hidden behind a ridge. The 21st Lancers, including a young Lieutenant Winston Churchill, charged a force they thought small, only to discover 2,500 warriors concealed in a depression. Chaos erupted. Sabers flashed. 3 Victoria Crosses were earned in those desperate minutes, and yet the empire advanced. Mahdist losses mounted, but still they fought, driven by prophecy, by loyalty, by rage. By midday, the battlefield was a furnace of death. Omdurman's fate was sealed not by betrayal, but by overwhelming force. As smoke curled above the plains, the Mahdist state crumbled beneath the boots of empire. Over 10,000 Mahdist fighters lay dead at Omdurman. Another 20,000 had fallen across the years of war. The Khalifa, Abdullahi ibn Muhammad, fled south with what remained of his army. But the dream was over. Kitchener marched into the ruins of Omdurman, not as a conqueror, but as the executor of imperial justice long delayed. The Anglo-Egyptian forces now ruled Sudan. In 1899, a new political fiction was born, the condominium, a dual British. Egyptian governance that was British in power, Egyptian in name, and Sudanese in neither. The Mahdi's rebellion, once ablaze with spiritual fire and righteous fury, had been extinguished by machine guns and railroads. Sudan entered a new era, not of independence, but occupation. The sands that had once buried Gordon now swallowed 1,000 other names, lost to history. The empire had avenged its ghost, and in doing so, claimed another.